The morning sun barely penetrated the thick clouds hanging over Springfield, Ohio, as Sarah Mitchell sat in the back seat of her grandmother's Civic. The 3-year-old pressed her small face against the cold window, watching the unfamiliar buildings pass by. She didn't understand where they were going or why her grandmother kept glancing at her with worried eyes reflected in the mirror. Sarah had once been a bright, talkative child who sang songs and laughed at silly jokes, but something had fundamentally changed in her over the past 8 months. The custody battle that consumed her parents' lives had infiltrated every aspect of her own existence, and at such a tender age, she was already learning that the world wasn't always safe or predictable. Mitchell, Sarah's grandmother, gripped the steering wheel as she navigated toward the courthouse. Her weathered hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the overwhelming weight of responsibility. At 62 years old, had never imagined she would be fighting for custody of her granddaughter. Her life had been stable, predictable, filled with gardening, knitting, and visits with family. But when Sarah's parents' marriage began to crumble 2 years ago, everything changed. The arguments that started quietly escalated into screaming matches. Sarah would cover her ears and hide under blankets, but the walls of their modest home were thin, and her parents' rage seeped through every crack. Sarah's mother, Jennifer Mitchell, had always been a vibrant, ambitious woman. She worked as a marketing manager at a successful tech company and had big dreams for her career and family. But approximately 1 year ago, Jennifer's drinking began to escalate. What started as wine with dinner became wine before dinner, then wine throughout the day. First noticed the problem when Jennifer showed up to Sarah's second birthday party with glassy eyes and slurred speech. At the time had said nothing, hoping it was just a bad day. But bad days became bad weeks, and bad weeks became a devastating pattern. The situation deteriorated further when Jennifer met a charismatic man with a troubled past, had been arrested twice for assault and once for drug possession. He moved into Jennifer's home within weeks of the meeting, seemingly charming his way past her better judgment. Sarah's father, David Mitchell, was a different kind of problem. He had always been a devoted father in the early years, the type of parent who attended every doctor's appointment and read bedtime stories with genuine enthusiasm. But as his marriage crumbled, David became increasingly bitter and emotionally unavailable. Rather than stepping up to protect Sarah from the chaos, he into himself, spending longer hours at work and eventually moving into an apartment across town. When he did spend time with Sarah, he was often distracted, his mind clearly elsewhere. Some of David's new friends weren't appropriate influences, and there were concerning incidents where Sarah had been exposed to behavior that made even his sister uncomfortable. Had confronted him about it, but he had dismissed her concerns, claiming she was overreacting and interfering. The custody battle officially began when, unable to watch her granddaughter suffer any longer, filed a petition to become Sarah's temporary guardian. This action ignited a legal war that nobody had anticipated. Jennifer's attorney argued that was meddling in family affairs and had no business interfering with a mother's rights. David's attorney countered by attacking age and claiming that a woman in her 60s couldn't properly care for an active toddler. The courtroom became where Sarah's was discussed in legal terms and statistics, reduced to case numbers and precedents. During these 8 months of legal proceedings, Sarah had experienced transformation of the most tragic kind. She had developed selective mutism, a psychological condition where she simply stopped speaking in certain environments, particularly when stressed. Social workers who visited the homes reported that Sarah barely communicated during their assessments. Teachers at her preschool noticed that she had become withdrawn, often sitting alone during playtime while other children engaged in creative, joyful activities. She had developed severe separation anxiety, crying inconsolably whenever left her side. More alarmingly, she had begun experiencing night terrors, waking in the darkness screaming about monsters and shadows, her small body drenched in sweat. Documented everything meticulously. She kept a journal of Sarah's behavioral changes, medical appointments, and emotional episodes. She collected photographs showing Sarah's bedroom at her home versus the condition of Sarah's room at Jennifer's apartment. She documented instances when Jennifer arrived late to pick up Sarah smelling of alcohol, or when made inappropriate comments in front of the child. She interviewed Sarah's preschool teacher, who reluctantly admitted that she had serious concerns about Sarah's welfare, but feared getting involved in a family matter. Even contacted the family's pediatrician, who agreed to provide testimony about the stress-related health issues Sarah had developed. The night before this fateful hearing, couldn't sleep. She sat in her kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea that had grown cold, staring at photographs of Sarah as an infant, smiling, carefree, innocent. She thought about how quickly childhood could be stolen, how quickly a bright light could dim. She had raised own children in this same home, and they had turned out well-adjusted and loving. She knew she could provide Sarah with stability, consistency, and unconditional love. But the legal system seemed indifferent to these truths. Custody cases were complex, and judges had to consider many factors. Would testimony be enough? Would Sarah's selective mutism work against them, making her seem like a troubled child rather than a traumatized one? Would the judge believe that a 62-year-old grandmother was a better guardian than a biological parent? Now, pulling into the courthouse parking lot, took a deep breath and looked at Sarah in the back seat. The little girl stared out the window, her expression blank and distant, unbuckled her and reached back to squeeze Sarah's tiny hand. "We're going to be okay, sweetheart," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure if she was trying to convince her granddaughter or herself. As they walked toward the imposing courthouse building, couldn't know that this day would change everything. She couldn't know that a police dog was about to play a role in her granddaughter's salvation. She only knew that she loved this child fiercely and would fight with every ounce of strength she possessed to keep her safe. The cold wind whipped around them as they climbed the courthouse steps, and Sarah pressed closer to her grandmother's side. Inside those walls, a judge was waiting. A decision was coming, and a little girl's entire future hung in the balance. Judge Harrison had served on the bench for 3 decades, presiding over thousands of cases that ranged from minor infractions to life-altering family disputes. In her 30 years of judicial service, she had witnessed the best and worst of human nature. She had seen families heal and families destroy themselves. She had made decisions that she believed were just, only to later wonder if she had gotten it right. But nothing had ever affected her quite like the custody cases involving traumatized children who couldn't or wouldn't speak. These cases haunted her, keeping her awake at night, making her question whether the justice system was truly equipped to protect society's most vulnerable members. Judge Harrison was a woman of principle, education, and forward-thinking philosophy. She had studied law at university and had been one of the first women appointed to the family court bench in Ohio. Throughout her career, she had continuously pursued professional development, attending seminars on child psychology, trauma theory, and innovative courtroom practices. She believed that the law should adapt to serve people, not that people should contort themselves to fit into the rigid structures of law. This philosophy had sometimes made her unpopular with traditionalist colleagues, but it had also earned her a reputation as a judge who genuinely cared about outcomes, not just procedures. The turning point in her thinking came during a seminar she attended in Chicago 6 months prior to Sarah's hearing. The seminar, titled Therapeutic Approaches in Family Court, Beyond Traditional Testimony, was conducted by Dr., a renowned child psychologist who had spent 15 years researching how traumatized children respond to different courtroom environments. Dr. presented compelling research demonstrating that traditional interrogation-style questioning actually reinforced trauma responses in children. The formal courtroom setting, the stern-faced adults, the legal terminology they couldn't understand, all of it created additional stress that caused children to shut down emotionally and verbally. However, Doctor's research also revealed something remarkable. The presence of certified therapy animals in courtrooms dramatically changed children's physiological responses. When a calm, non-threatening animal was present, children's cortisol levels, the stress hormone, decreased significantly. Their heart rates stabilized. Their breathing became more regular. Most importantly, in this calmer state, children were more likely to communicate authentically. The animal served as an emotional anchor, a source of comfort that helped children feel safe enough to express themselves. Doctor presented case studies from courts across the country that had implemented animal-assisted therapy programs, and the results were extraordinary. Not only did children respond better, but the testimony gathered in these sessions was often more reliable and detailed than traditional questioning. Judge Harrison had sat in that seminar with growing excitement. This was the answer she had been searching for. This was how she could better serve the children who came before her. She had immediately begun researching which animals were most effective and what training protocols were necessary. She learned that while various animals could serve therapeutic purposes, dogs were particularly effective because of their innate ability to read human emotions and respond with appropriate behaviors. A well-trained dog could sense anxiety and provide comfort without being prompted. A dog could remain calm under pressure in ways that humans often couldn't. Upon returning to Springfield, Judge Harrison had contacted the local police department and specifically requested to speak with anyone who oversaw the K-9 unit. That conversation led her to Detective James, a decorated officer with 20 years of experience and an extraordinary passion for his work. When Judge Harrison explained her vision, using a therapy dog in family court proceedings, had initially seemed skeptical. But as she explained the research and the potential benefits, she watched understanding dawn across his face. Detective agreed to meet with her in person, and he brought something unexpected: photographs and certificates documenting Max's background. Max wasn't just an ordinary police dog. He was a 5-year-old German Shepherd with an unusual history. Max had been specially bred by a nonprofit organization that trained dogs for multiple purposes. Initially, Max had been trained as a standard police dog, excelling in narcotics detection and suspect apprehension. But his handler had noticed something unique about Max's temperament. He was unusually gentle with children. When the K-9 unit visited schools or community events, Max would approach children with a calm demeanor that seemed almost therapeutic. The nonprofit organization that had initially bred Max had been searching for dogs with this precise combination of skills. The training and discipline of a police dog combined with the gentle nature needed for therapeutic work. When mentioned Max's unique qualities, the organization had contacted him about a specialized certification program. Max had completed intensive training in courtroom protocols, trauma response recognition, and therapeutic animal behavior. He had participated in over 40 family court cases across multiple states, and his success rate was phenomenal. In cases where Max was present, children were significantly more likely to provide clear, consistent testimony. More importantly, the outcomes in those cases showed better long-term for the children involved. Judge Harrison had been moved by Max's story and his obvious devotion to his partner. She could see that wasn't simply a police officer. He was a man with a deep understanding of trauma, psychology, and the intersection between law enforcement and community healing. Explained that Max's presence changed the entire dynamic of a courtroom. It wasn't about the dog being a trick or a gimmick. It was about creating an environment where a traumatized child could access their own truthfulness. The dog didn't provide answers. It simply helped remove the barriers that prevented answers from emerging. Judge Harrison made the decision that afternoon. She would use Max in Sarah's hearing. It was risky. The attorneys might object. The case might become the subject of legal challenges. Her colleagues might criticize her for being unconventional. But she had learned through decades of judicial experience that true justice sometimes required courage. The law books could guide her on procedure, but her conscience had to guide her on what was right for this child. In the days leading up to the hearing, Judge Harrison and detective met multiple times to plan. They discussed Sarah's specific situation, her documented trauma symptoms, and the questions that needed to be answered. They developed a protocol that would minimize stress while gathering crucial information. Explained that Max would be introduced gradually, that the dog would be positioned to provide comfort without being invasive, and that the entire process would be carefully controlled to ensure Sarah's remained paramount. Also explained the science behind what they were attempting. When a child was in a state of fear or anxiety, their brain's prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for logical thinking and truthful communication, essentially shut down. The amygdala, the fear center of the brain, took over, triggering fight-or-flight responses. By creating a calming presence through Max's presence, they could help Sarah's prefrontal cortex remain activated. In this state, children tended to respond with greater authenticity, expressing their genuine feelings rather than what they thought adults wanted to hear. Judge Harrison felt a profound sense of purpose as she prepared for this hearing. She was about to attempt something revolutionary in her courthouse, something that could change not just Sarah's life, but potentially influence how family courts across America approached cases involving traumatized children. She didn't know if it would work, but she knew she had to try. As she reviewed Sarah's case file one final time, she whispered a quiet prayer. Tomorrow, a little girl would face a police dog in a courtroom. And whatever happened next would matter deeply. The Springfield Family Court building was constructed in 1987 from gray concrete and imposing glass. It had always seemed like a fortress to cold, institutional, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. The morning of the hearing, she arrived 30 minutes early, needing time to mentally prepare herself and to help Sarah adjust to the overwhelming environment. The courthouse hallways echoed with footsteps and distant voices, creating a cacophony of sound that made Sarah press her small body against leg. The little girl's breathing had become shallow, almost hyperventilating, and could feel her granddaughter's entire frame trembling beneath the pink dress that had carefully selected that morning. Sarah's pink dress had white flowers embroidered across the chest, and had chosen it specifically because it was Sarah's favorite. Wen had suggested wearing it to visit the big building. Sarah had nodded silently, understanding on some level that this day was different, that it mattered in ways her young mind couldn't fully comprehend. Had braided Sarah's curls carefully, tying them back with a white ribbon. She had wanted Sarah to look like the bright, beautiful child she was beneath the trauma, not to influence the judge, but to remind everyone in that courtroom that they were discussing a real person, not just a case number. The courtroom itself was intimidatingly formal. High ceilings stretched upward, and mahogany panels lined the walls. The judge's bench sat elevated on a dais, emphasizing its position of authority. Rows of wooden benches filled the gallery. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh white glow over everything, making the room feel sterile and unwelcoming. On one side of the courtroom sat Jennifer Mitchell with her attorney, Thomas, a slick lawyer in an expensive suit who had built his career on winning custody cases regardless of the underlying circumstances. Jennifer had dressed carefully too, in conservative business attire that projected stability and competence. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, but could see the tension in Jennifer's jaw, the way her fingers gripped the table's edge with white knuckles. On the other side sat David Mitchell with his attorney, Sandra Monroe, a woman in her 50s who had worked in family law for 20 years. David looked nervous, constantly adjusting his tie and glancing toward Sarah. He had been a loving father once, reminded herself, though it seemed almost impossible to remember that version of him now. The man sitting in the courtroom appeared diminished somehow, as if his own internal struggles had physically aged him. Wondered if he truly understood what was at stake, or if he was simply going through motions, letting his attorney guide him toward predetermined outcomes. And Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table, directly across from Jennifer and David. Sarah clutched a small stuffed rabbit that had belonged to his children when they were young. The rabbit was worn, its fur matted in places, but it had survived 4 decades and multiple children. Sarah held it to her chest like a shield against the chaos surrounding her. She hadn't spoken since entering the courthouse, not even to whisper goodbye to her preschool teacher that morning. The silence was becoming her constant companion, a protective mechanism that allowed her to retreat from a world that had become too difficult to navigate. Judge Harrison entered through a side door with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. She was a tall woman with silver hair styled in a neat bob, and she wore her judicial robes with the ease of someone who had inhabited this role for decades. Her eyes were kind but serious. She surveyed the courtroom, taking in the tension that seemed to vibrate through the air itself. She nodded slightly toward the bailiff, and the hearing officially began. There were opening statements from both attorneys. Thomas argued that was attempting to interfere with a mother's fundamental rights. Sandra Monroe presented David as a devoted father who had simply made mistakes during a difficult divorce. Attorney presented carefully documented evidence of the conditions in both parents' homes and Sarah's deteriorating emotional state. Everything proceeded according to standard protocol. Witnesses were called, social workers, the preschool teacher, despite her obvious discomfort with being placed in this situation, reluctantly described the concerning behavioral changes she had observed in Sarah. The family pediatrician presented medical documentation of stress-related symptoms. The tension in the courtroom escalated with each testimony, with both Jennifer and David becoming increasingly agitated. Jennifer's attorney repeatedly objected to questions, and David's attorney attempted to minimize the significance of the evidence being presented. Then, around mid-morning, Judge Harrison called for a brief recess. She announced that there would be a special assessment conducted with Sarah before the hearing concluded. Whispers erupted throughout the gallery. The attorney leaned over and whispered, "I'm not sure what she's doing, but trust me, Judge Harrison has a reputation for unexpected strategies." Sarah had been taken to a small waiting room adjacent to the courtroom, where she sat with a court-appointed advocate, a kind woman named Susan, who had brought coloring books and crayons to try to keep the child occupied. When the hearing reconvened 30 minutes later, the atmosphere had shifted somehow. There was a sense of anticipation, a collective holding of breath. Judge Harrison made an announcement that caused several people in the gallery to gasp. She explained that she had arranged for a certified therapy animal to assist with Sarah's testimony, as the child had been unable to communicate effectively through traditional questioning methods. She assured the courtroom that all protocols had been followed, that this was a well-established therapeutic practice, and that the animal's presence was designed to help, not harm. Thomas immediately stood to object. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This could compromise the integrity of the proceedings. This is a courtroom, not a petting zoo." Judge Harrison silenced him with a look that could have frozen fire. She explained that the decision had been made in the best interests of the child and that objections could be noted in the record, but the assessment would proceed. Then the courtroom doors opened again, and Detective James walked in. He was a solid man in his mid-50s, with the bearing of someone who had seen difficult things and remained unmoved by them. But it was the creature beside him that captured everyone's attention. Max appeared in the doorway, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The German Shepherd was magnificent, a large, powerful animal with a black and tan coat that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. His ears were alert, his posture was controlled and confident, and his dark eyes reflected intelligence and calm awareness. Sarah gasped audibly from the waiting room doorway where Susan had brought her to see what was happening. The little girl's entire body went rigid. Sitting in the gallery, felt her heart jump into her throat. Jennifer leaned back in her chair, her face going pale. David stared at the dog with an expression of complete surprise. The courtroom had become absolutely silent, suspended in a moment of uncertainty and anticipation. Detective guided Max forward with gentle confidence, moving toward the center of the courtroom. Judge Harrison watched with calm assurance. Everyone sensed that this moment would define the entire proceeding. As Max stepped into the courtroom, as his paws touched the polished floor, as his presence filled the space with an energy that was both powerful and strangely comforting, everyone understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. This was not standard judicial procedure. This was something revolutionary, something that could change everything about how justice was served to vulnerable children. Sarah's hands trembled as she watched the massive dog, closed her eyes and prayed. Detective moved with practiced precision, his movements deliberate and measured. He understood that Max's success depended entirely on the energy he projected. Dogs were incredibly perceptive creatures, capable of reading human emotions with an accuracy that often surpassed psychological instruments. If projected nervousness or uncertainty, Max would pick up on it, and the entire dynamic would be compromised. Instead, he channeled absolute confidence, the kind that came from hundreds of successful interactions. He guided Max toward the center of the courtroom with a slack leash, allowing the dog to sense the space without feeling restrained. Sarah watched from the doorway, her small body trembling violently. Susan, the court advocate, had her hand on Sarah's shoulder, ready to guide her to the center of the courtroom whenever Judge Harrison indicated. But for now, Sarah simply observed. The massive dog was moving with surprising grace for an animal of his size. His paws clicked softly against the polished courtroom floor, a sound that somehow made him seem both more real and more intimidating. Sarah's breathing had become rapid and shallow, nearly hyperventilation. Every instinct in her 3-year-old body screamed at her to run, to hide, to escape from this enormous creature that her understanding of the world. Judge Harrison remained completely still on her elevated bench, observing with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades learning to read situations. She noticed the color draining from Sarah's face. She watched the little girl's fingers curl around the stuffed rabbit. She saw the way it had pressed her hand to her chest, as if trying to contain her own anxiety. And she saw something in Max's demeanor that gave her confidence. The dog's entire focus had shifted toward Sarah. Despite his training as a police dog, despite his years of narcotics detection and suspect apprehension, Max had sensed something in that small, trembling child, vulnerability that needed protection. Guided Max to the center of the courtroom and then executed a series of hand signals that were barely perceptible to the untrained eye. Max slowed his pace, his head lowered to a non-threatening angle, his ears relaxed slightly. Most importantly, Max's body language shifted from that of a working police dog to something entirely different, a dog in therapeutic mode. Every muscle in Max's body communicated calm, patience, and acceptance. Had explained to Judge Harrison that this transformation was what separated Max from ordinary police dogs. Most working dogs maintained an alert, somewhat intimidating presence. Max could consciously shift his entire demeanor, becoming what the situation required. As Sarah watched this transformation, something fundamental shifted within her as well. The dog that had seemed terrifying moments before began to seem different. The fear didn't disappear entirely, but it was joined by something else, curiosity, perhaps, or the faint glimmering of hope that this creature might not be dangerous after all. Guided Max into a sitting position directly in front of Sarah. The dog's massive head was now positioned at eye level with the small girl. They were separated by perhaps 15 feet of courtroom floor, but the distance seemed both immense and negligible simultaneously. Looked toward Judge Harrison and nodded slightly. The judge, in turn, looked at Susan and Sarah and made a subtle gesture indicating they should proceed. Susan gently guided Sarah forward, her hand never leaving the child's shoulder. With each step, Sarah's trembling intensified. Her breath came in short gasps. The stuffed rabbit was now pressed so tightly against her body that worried the child might cut off her own circulation. But Sarah walked forward, drawn by something she couldn't quite name or understand. Max remained perfectly motionless as Sarah approached. This was crucial. Any sudden movement, any greeting behavior that might seem threatening to a traumatized child, could undo everything they were attempting. Instead, Max simply sat, his dark brown eyes following Sarah's approach with what could only be described as tenderness. Those eyes had seen difficult things. Max had been present during narcotics raids, had confronted dangerous suspects, had experienced the harsh realities of law enforcement. Yet in this moment, those experienced eyes held only patient understanding. Sarah stopped about 6 feet from Max, frozen in a state of suspended fear and fascination. Seconds stretched like hours. The entire courtroom seemed to be holding its collective breath. Even Jennifer and David had fallen silent, temporarily united by the enormity of this moment. Found herself praying in a way she hadn't since her own children were young. Prayers that weren't articulated in words, but existed as pure emotional energy, directed toward the connection forming between her granddaughter and the therapy dog. Then something remarkable happened. Max's tail, which had been still, began to move, not with exuberant wagging, but with slow, gentle movements that communicated contentment without threat. The movement was so subtle that people in the back of the gallery might not have noticed, but Sarah noticed. She had become of every nuance of the dog's behavior, her survival instincts finely attuned to reading threats. And this tail movement, this gentle, peaceful motion, communicated something her traumatized nervous system recognized as safe. Sarah's breathing began to slow, not dramatically but noticeably. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up around her ears in protective tension, dropped slightly. The stranglehold she had on her stuffed rabbit loosened, just barely. Without conscious decision-making, guided purely by some deep intuition that transcended her age and experience, Sarah took one small step forward, then another. The distance between herself and Max decreased by half. Remained absolutely still, allowing this connection to form organically. Judge Harrison watched with the intensity of someone witnessing something sacred. Hand flew to her mouth as she realized what was happening. Her granddaughter, the child who hadn't spoken in weeks, who flinched at loud voices, who had retreated so far into herself that she seemed almost unreachable, was moving toward the massive dog with something that looked almost like trust. Sarah was now standing directly in front of Max. The top of her small head barely reached the dog's shoulders. She looked up into his face and Max looked down into hers. There was a moment of pure connection, a recognition between two beings who had both experienced trauma in different ways, who both carried wounds that the world couldn't see. Max's tail continued its gentle motion. Sarah's tiny hand reached out, trembling still, but reaching nonetheless. Her fingers, small and pale, extended toward Max's fur. The moment her skin made contact with Max's coat, something shifted in the courtroom. It was subtle but profound, like a door opening that had been locked for months. Sarah's posture changed. Her breathing synchronized with the dog's measured breaths, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, saw something flicker in her granddaughter's eyes that resembled peace. Max closed his eyes briefly as Sarah's hand made contact with his fur, accepting her touch with the wisdom of an animal that understood his role in this moment. He was not simply a police dog or a therapy animal. In this instant, he was a mirror for Sarah's own capacity for trust. He was a physical manifestation of safety in a world that had felt profoundly unsafe. He was a being who asked nothing of her except to be present, to feel, to begin the long journey toward healing. Judge Harrison leaned back in her chair, watching this interaction with the satisfaction of someone who had made exactly the right decision. Whatever happened next in this courtroom, whatever words were spoken or tears shed, this moment of connection between a traumatized child and a patient animal had already changed something fundamental. It had opened a door. And now, all that remained was to see what truths might walk through that door into the light. The silence that enveloped the courtroom was unlike any silence that had existed there before. It was not the absence of sound, but rather the presence of something far more powerful, the collective holding of breath, the suspension of time itself. Judge Harrison remained motionless on her elevated bench, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. She had orchestrated this moment with calculated precision, understanding that what happened in the next few minutes would determine the trajectory of Sarah's entire life. Around the courtroom, everyone seemed to understand that they were at the precipice of something momentous. Sarah continued stroking Max's fur, her small hand moving in gentle, repetitive motions across the dog's shoulder and back. With each touch, her breathing continued to deepen, to become more regular. The terrified child who had entered the courtroom was gradually being replaced by something else. A child still frightened, still carrying the weight of trauma, but a child who had found an anchor, a touchstone of safety in an otherwise chaotic world. Watched her granddaughter with tears streaming down her face, hardly daring to breathe. This was the most present Sarah had seemed in months. This was a glimpse of who her granddaughter could be if given the chance to heal. Judge Harrison waited a full 3 minutes before speaking. The pause was intentional. She understood the power of silence, the way it could settle a nervous system, the way it could create space for truth to emerge. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but carried the weight of authority. "Sarah, sweetheart," she began gently, "I want to ask you something very important. This is a special question, and I need you to listen carefully." Sarah's hand continued its rhythmic motion across Max's fur. She didn't look up, but her entire body had shifted into a state of listening attentiveness. "I want you to look at Max," the judge continued, "and I want you to tell me something. Who makes you feel the safest at home? Who is the person who takes the best care of you?" The question hung in the air, deceptively simple in its phrasing but seismic in its implications. This question was the heart of the entire proceeding, the central inquiry around which everything else orbited. In asking this question, Judge Harrison was not simply seeking information. She was creating space for Sarah's deepest truth to emerge, the truth that lived beneath layers of fear, beneath the careful silence that had protected Sarah for so long, beneath the cognitive structures that had allowed her to survive in an unsafe environment. Sarah's hand stilled on Max's fur. The little girl's breathing, which had become so regular, suddenly became almost imperceptibly faster. Inside Sarah's small body and developing mind, a conflict was occurring. Part of her, the part shaped by fear and survival instinct, wanted to give the answer that would please the adults, the answer that wouldn't cause more chaos or confrontation. Children learn early to read the emotional climate around them, to sense what answers are wanted, to tailor their responses to the expectations of authority figures. Sarah had learned this lesson well through months of custody proceedings. But another part of Sarah, a deeper part, a truer part, knew the answer with absolute certainty. This part of her was connected to Max now, grounded through the gentle contact with the therapy dog's fur. Max's presence created a field of safety around Sarah, a protective container within which truth could exist without threat. The dog's calm heartbeat, the warmth of his body, the unconditional acceptance radiating from his being, all of this created conditions under which Sarah's authentic self could emerge. Held her breath, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had turned white. She understood what was about to happen on some intuitive level, though she didn't allow herself to hope for it. She had learned through 8 months of legal proceedings that hopping led to devastation when hope was disappointed. Jennifer gripped her attorney's arm so forcefully that Thomas winced. She could sense something shifting, something moving toward an outcome she didn't want. David stared at the scene unfolding before him with an expression of dawning realization, as if he was finally beginning to understand the gravity of his absence from his daughter's life. Seconds passed, long, agonizing seconds that felt like hours to those watching. Sarah's lips parted slightly, her throat constricted, the physical manifestation of the internal struggle between fear and truth, found herself silently begging, "Please, sweetheart, tell the truth. You're safe. You're so safe." Judge Harrison waited with the patience of someone who understood that rushing this moment would destroy its power. Detective remained absolutely still, his hand resting lightly on Max's leash, his entire being communicating calm authority. Then, in a voice so quiet that several people in the gallery had to lean forward to hear it, Sarah whispered 2 words, "Grandma safe." The courtroom didn't explode immediately. There was a fraction of a second of absolute stillness, as if the entire room needed a moment to comprehend what it had just witnessed. Then, all at once, the dam broke, released a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. Tears streamed down her face with such force that she could barely see. Her entire body shook with the release of 8 months of terror, uncertainty, and desperate hope that had finally crystallized into this moment of validation. Sarah's mother made a sound that was half gasp, half protest. "No," she said, shaking her head forcefully. "That's not, she doesn't understand what she's saying." But everyone in the courtroom knew better. The clarity in Sarah's voice, the precision of her word choice, the way those two simple words carried such profound truth, it was unmistakable. A 3-year-old who had barely spoken in months had just delivered testimony more powerful than any expert witness could provide. Jennifer's attorney jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, I must object. This testimony is inadmissible. The child is clearly being influenced by the presence of the animal. This entire proceeding is compromised by—" Judge Harrison raised her hand, silencing him with a gesture that was almost gentle but absolutely firm. "Objection noted, Mr. However, the child's statement has been made and documented. We will proceed." David sat back in his chair, his face ashen. He understood, perhaps for the first time, what his inaction and absence had cost. His daughter had been crying out for safety, and he had not been present to provide it. Watched her granddaughter with an expression of such profound love and validation that it seemed to shimmer in the courtroom air itself. Sarah continued stroking Max's fur, unaware of the earthquake she had just created with 2 whispered words. Max, with the wisdom of animals that understand their role in human healing, turned his head slightly and licked Sarah's hand once, a gesture of profound affirmation. In that single gesture from the therapy dog, Sarah received what she needed most: confirmation that her truth was valid, that her instincts were correct, that seeking safety with her grandmother was not only understandable, but was the right choice. Judge Harrison made a notation in her judicial record. She looked at Sarah with eyes filled with compassion and respect. This child, so small and vulnerable, had just provided the testimony that would reshape her entire future. The 2 words "grandma safe" would echo through that courtroom for weeks afterward, would be discussed in legal journals, would become the foundation upon which an entirely new approach to child-centered justice would be built. But in this moment, Sarah simply continued to stroke Max's fur, finding in the dog's presence the validation and safety she needed to continue breathing, to continue living, to continue the journey toward healing that was only just beginning. The words "grandma safe" had barely faded from the courtroom air when Judge Harrison made a decisive call. She ordered an immediate and comprehensive investigation into both Sarah's mother's and father's homes. The traditional custody investigation timeline, which normally took weeks or months, was accelerated to days. Judge Harrison understood that momentum was crucial. While everyone's attention was focused on the hearing, while emotions were heightened and everyone understood the stakes, evidence should be gathered and documented with absolute precision. She appointed 3 separate social workers to conduct simultaneous investigations, with instructions to document everything with photographs, video, and detailed written observations. When the social workers arrived at Jennifer's apartment on Maple Street, they were immediately struck by the condition of the space. The living room was cluttered with empty wine bottles, some standing upright on tables and countertops, others knocked over on the floor. The kitchen sink overflowed with unwashed dishes, some with rotting food residue that had begun to mold. The social workers photographed everything, their expressions hardening with each room they entered. In the bedroom that was supposed to be Sarah's, they found a small mattress on the floor with no sheets, just a stained blanket that smelled of mildew and something else, something that made the social workers' stomachs turn. Sarah's toys were scattered haphazardly throughout the apartment, many broken or damaged. There were no books, no educational materials, nothing that suggested a child's developmental needs were being considered. In the bathroom, Medications were stored in an unlocked cabinet at child height, antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, and bottles without proper labels. The kitchen contained no child-appropriate foods, only adult provisions and numerous alcohol bottles in various stages of consumption. Most disturbing was the evidence of his presence throughout the home. His clothing was scattered about. His personal items, including a locked box that social workers suspected contained drugs, were stored casually in the living room. Photographs of with his arm around Jennifer were displayed on the mantelpiece, but there was not a single family photograph showing Sarah with either parent. The social workers conducted interviews with the neighbors, many of whom painted a deeply concerning picture. One elderly neighbor reported having called Child Protective Services twice in the previous 6 months due to hearing Sarah crying for extended periods while her mother slept. Another neighbor described witnessing shouting aggressively at Sarah over a spilled cup of juice, his face reddening with anger over an incident that any reasonable adult would have handled with patience and understanding. A third neighbor reported seeing Sarah standing at the apartment door at midnight, crying for her mother, while Jennifer was passed out on the couch inside. The pattern that emerged was unmistakable. Sarah was being neglected, her basic needs for supervision and safety were not being met, and she was being exposed to inappropriate adult behavior and potentially dangerous individuals. In stark contrast, when social workers arrived at its home, they entered a different world entirely. The house was clean, organized, and filled with evidence of careful, loving care. Sarah's bedroom was bright and cheerful with age-appropriate decorations, books organized on shelves, toys neatly stored in bins. Her bed had clean sheets, soft blankets, and a shape like a moon to help ease her nighttime fears. The walls displayed photographs of Sarah at various ages, drawings that Sarah had created, and a bulletin board where had documented Sarah's milestones and achievements. Educational posters teaching letters, numbers, and colors hung at child height, encouraging learning through play. The kitchen was well stocked with nutritious foods, fresh fruits and vegetables, whole-grain bread, milk, cheese, and age-appropriate snacks. Had even prepared a special chart showing Sarah's dietary preferences and any foods she needed to avoid. The home had clear safety features, outlet covers, cabinet locks on cleaning supplies, and gates preventing access to potentially dangerous areas. The social workers found evidence of medical care, appointment records for routine checkups, vaccination records meticulously organized, and a medication chart for Sarah's occasional illnesses with clear dosing instructions based on her age and weight. When neighbors were interviewed about, their testimonies were uniformly positive. The elderly woman across the street described as a saint, someone who had devoted her life to her granddaughters. A younger mother who lived 2 doors down spoke about how it helped her when she was struggling postpartum, how kindness and wisdom had made a difference. Teachers at Sarah's preschool provided written statements describing the observable difference in Sarah's demeanor on days when picked her up versus days when her mother came for her. On days, Sarah was animated, happy, engaged with her peers. On Jennifer days, which had become increasingly rare, Sarah was withdrawn, anxious, hypervigilant. Medical records were obtained and reviewed by pediatricians who had been consulted by the court. Sarah's health history at home showed regular checkups, appropriate growth and development, and no concerning health issues beyond the stress-related symptoms documented during the custody dispute. Her health records from Jennifer's care told a different story. Missed appointments, delayed vaccinations, and documentation of infections and illnesses that had gone untreated until they became severe enough to force emergency medical intervention. Psychological assessments were conducted on Sarah by Dr., a child psychologist with 30 years of experience in trauma and attachment. Through play-based assessment methods, Dr. documented clear indicators of developmental trauma. Sarah's play behaviors were characterized by themes of abandonment, danger, and unsafe caregiving. She repeatedly acted out scenarios where a small figure was separated from a protective figure, showing anxiety about separation that was inappropriate for her age. However, when placed in presence during a portion of the assessment, Sarah's play immediately shifted. She became more engaged, more creative, more developmentally appropriate. The transformation was documented and videotaped, providing objective evidence of the relationship dynamics. Financial records were examined, revealing that Jennifer had spent substantial amounts of money on alcohol while Sarah's basic needs, new clothing, shoes, age-appropriate educational materials, had been neglected. Financial records, in contrast, showed careful budgeting to ensure Sarah had everything necessary for healthy development, had even taken a part-time job to supplement her retirement income specifically to provide additional resources for Sarah. Social services records were pulled, revealing that there had been 3 previous reports of concern about Sarah's welfare at Jennifer's residence. Each report had been filed by teachers, neighbors, and healthcare providers who had observed concerning signs. These reports had never been fully investigated, but they existed in the system as indicators of a pattern of concern. Criminal background was thoroughly documented. Arrests for assault, domestic violence charges that had been dropped due to witness intimidation, drug possession, and a restraining order from a previous girlfriend who had feared for her safety around him. The evidence was overwhelming and heartbreaking. Sarah's 2 whispered words, "Grandma safe," had opened a door into a reality far darker than anyone in that courtroom had fully comprehended. This was not a case of 2 loving parents who had simply made mistakes during a difficult divorce. This was a case of a child's safety being systematically compromised, of a child's needs being ignored, of a child reaching a breaking point and finally, with the help of a therapy dog and a wise judge, finding the courage to tell the truth about where she felt safe. The documentation would become crucial in the legal proceedings that followed. The evidence was irrefutable, objective, and comprehensive, and it all traced back to that moment in the courtroom when a 3-year-old girl, holding onto a dog's fur, had whispered 2 words that changed everything. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah whispered those 2 transformative words in the courtroom. 3 weeks of investigation, documentation, legal briefings, and careful consideration. 3 weeks during which Judge Harrison had methodically reviewed every piece of evidence, every testimony, every photograph, every psychological assessment. She had consulted with child psychologists, family law experts, and legal scholars. She had written her decision with the meticulous care of someone who understood that her words would potentially shape the legal landscape of family court proceedings for years to come. On a cold March morning with weak sunlight filtering through the courthouse windows, Judge Harrison took her position on the bench. The courtroom was packed, not just with the immediate parties involved in the case, but with legal observers, reporters, child advocacy organizations, and fellow judges who had heard about this extraordinary proceeding. The gallery buzzed with anticipation. Sat quietly beside Sarah, who held her stuffed rabbit and fidgeted nervously. Jennifer sat rigidly beside her attorney, her face a mask of controlled fury. David looked diminished, almost defeated, as if he already knew how this would end and was simply going through the motions of witnessing his own failure. Judge Harrison had a thick sheaf of papers before her, her written judicial decision. She began to read, her voice clear and measured, carrying the weight of judicial authority and moral conviction. This court has carefully reviewed all evidence presented in this matter, including testimony from social workers, medical professionals, educational experts, and the observations documented during the therapeutic assessment conducted on February 15th of this year. The evidence is overwhelming and unequivocal. She paused, letting her words settle into the courtroom atmosphere like stones dropped into still water. She then proceeded through a comprehensive review of the evidence. She documented Jennifer's substance abuse issues, the dangerous environment at her residence, the presence of and his criminal history, the testimony of neighbors regarding neglect, and the medical evidence showing deferred care. The minor child has been exposed to environmental conditions that pose clear and present danger to her physical health, emotional, and psychological development, Judge Harrison stated. The testimony from multiple independent observers corroborates a pattern of neglect extending over an extended period. She then addressed David's case with measured but firm language. While the father has not engaged in the same level of egregious conduct as the mother, his abdication of parental responsibility during this critical period cannot be overlooked. A child requires not only material provisions but emotional presence and consistent protection. The minor child in this case has been deprived of these essential elements by both biological parents during the period in question. Then came the pivot that everyone was waiting for. Judge Harrison addressed directly, speaking with profound respect and recognition of her role. The grandmother has demonstrated extraordinary commitment to this child's. She has created a safe, nurturing, developmentally appropriate environment. She has ensured medical care, educational advancement, and emotional security. Most importantly, she has advocated consistently and courageously for this child's protection, despite significant legal and emotional obstacles. Judge Harrison then made her ruling. This court grants full temporary custody of Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell to her maternal grandmother, Mitchell, effective immediately. Temporary custody shall remain in effect for a period of 12 months, at which time this court will conduct a review hearing to determine if permanent custody should be granted. The courtroom erupted. His face crumpled with emotion as tears streamed down her cheeks. Sarah, sensing her grandmother's emotional release, began to cry as well, but these were different tears, tears of relief and validation. People in the gallery wiped their eyes. Some were crying openly. Reporters immediately began typing on their devices, understanding that they were witnessing something significant. But Judge Harrison was not finished. She continued reading her decision, addressing the conditional aspects of Jennifer's visitation rights. The mother shall be permitted supervised visitation with the minor child, contingent upon the following conditions. First, she must complete a comprehensive substance abuse treatment program at an accredited facility. Second, she must complete a parenting education course specifically designed for parents with substance abuse issues. Third, she must undergo individual psychotherapy with a licensed mental health professional for a minimum of 12 months. Fourth, all visitation shall be supervised by court-appointed professionals in a neutral setting until such time as this court determines the mother has demonstrated sustained recovery and appropriate parental capacity. She then addressed directly through the written decision. Any individual with a criminal history of violence shall not be present in the residence during visits or at any time the minor child is in the mother's care pending court review and determination of appropriate contact protocols. What came next was the most extraordinary part of the decision, the passage that would ripple through family courts across the nation. Judge Harrison wrote, "This court finds that the child's nonverbal and verbal communication with the certified therapy dog during the February 15th assessment provided crucial insight into the child's genuine welfare and emotional needs. While traditional interrogation-based testimony proved ineffective with this traumatized child, the therapeutic animal created conditions under which the minor could access her own truthfulness and express her deepest needs and fears. The child's statement, 'Grandma safe,' delivered while in proximity to a calm, accepting, non-judgmental presence, provided testimony of remarkable clarity and reliability. This evidence, combined with subsequent investigation findings, conclusively demonstrates that the maternal grandmother's home is the appropriate and safe environment for the minor." She continued, "Furthermore, this court recommends that the therapeutic animal-assisted courtroom assessment protocol be considered for implementation in other family court proceedings involving traumatized or non-communicative children. The protocol, developed in collaboration with Detective James and his certified therapy dog, Max, demonstrates efficacy in facilitating authentic child communication and represents an innovative advancement in child-centered justice practices. Judge Harrison then established additional conditions for ongoing support. She ordered that Sarah continue receiving psychological counseling to process her trauma and support her healing journey. She mandated that receive training in trauma-informed parenting to best support Sarah's recovery. She also ordered that the family be connected with community resources, including support groups for grandparents raising and mental health services. In a particularly striking passage, Judge Harrison addressed the broader implications of her decision. This case illustrates the inadequacy of traditional adversarial legal proceedings when applied to child protection matters. Children are not miniature adults capable of navigating complex legal processes. They communicate through behavior, emotion, and intuition. The justice system must evolve to honor these forms of communication. The minor child in this case did not require aggressive questioning or legal maneuvering. She required safety, compassion, and an opportunity to express her truth in an environment free from threat. It is the hope of this court that other judicial systems will consider implementing similar protocols. The decision was released to the media immediately. By evening, it had spread across news outlets. Judge uses therapy dog to help traumatized child speak truth in custody hearing. Legal scholars began discussing the case in academic journals. Child psychology organizations praised Judge Harrison's innovative approach. Family law attorneys debated the implications for their own practice. Universities requested copies of the decision to include in their curricula. Judge Harrison had made a decision that honored both the letter of the law and the spirit of justice. She had protected a vulnerable child. She had held negligent parents accountable. And she had created a precedent that would inspire systemic change in how family courts approached cases involving non-communicative or traumatized children. Most importantly, she had validated Sarah's 2 whispered words and transformed them into law, into policy, into a new paradigm for protecting vulnerable children within the American justice system. The ripples from that moment in the courtroom would spread far beyond Springfield, Ohio, touching countless other children's lives in ways that could not yet be measured, but would certainly be profound. 6 months had passed since that cold February morning when Sarah whispered 2 words that would alter the course of her life. Now, in late August, the Springfield courthouse felt different, warmer somehow, filled with possibility instead of dread. Sarah Mitchell, now 4 years old, walked through the glass doors with the confidence of a child who knew she was loved, protected, and safe. Gone was the withdrawn, anxious little girl who flinched at loud noises and retreated into terrified silence. In her place was a vibrant child with bright eyes, an infectious laugh, and a spirit that seemed to radiate joy. The transformation had been nothing short of miraculous, though understood it was far more than miracle. It was the result of consistent love, professional support, and the kind of sustained emotional commitment that only grandmother's love could provide. In those 6 months following the custody hearing, had devoted herself entirely to Sarah's healing. She had taken Sarah to Doctor, the child psychologist, weekly for therapy sessions. Doctor had taught Sarah techniques to process her trauma, to express her emotions in healthy ways, to understand that nothing that had happened to her was her fault. Gradually, Sarah had begun to speak more freely. The selective mutism that had characterized her silence began to dissolve as her nervous system recognized that speaking was safe, that her voice mattered, that her words were heard and respected. She had words for feelings she couldn't previously articulate. She told about being scared when shouted. She talked about being hungry at her mother's apartment. She described the loneliness of isolation in unfamiliar places. And with each word, with each expression of truth, she released a little more of the trauma that had been locked inside her small body. Her preschool teacher reported remarkable changes. Sarah had blossomed academically and socially. She now engaged enthusiastically in classroom activities, participated in group discussions, and had made genuine friendships with other children. During a parent observation day, watched from the back of the classroom as Sarah led a group of 4 children through a creative block-building project, directing the action with confidence and collaboration. When Sarah noticed watching, she ran over and hugged her grandmother with such spontaneous affection that other parents turned to look. There was something about the quality of that embrace, the absolute certainty it conveyed about safety and belonging, that made several of them wipe away tears. Had also taken precautions to ensure Sarah's physical health and development. She had scheduled comprehensive medical appointments, addressing the nutritional deficiencies that had developed during months of neglect. Sarah had grown taller, her cheeks had filled out, and her energy levels had stabilized in the way of a healthy child. Her pediatrician noted with satisfaction that Sarah's growth curve had corrected, that her development was catching up to age-appropriate norms, and that the stress-related symptoms that had plagued her were gradually resolving. But perhaps most importantly, had created a home environment where Sarah could simply be a child. There was consistency, regular bedtimes, nutritious meals, predictable routines that Sarah could depend on. There was play, genuine, joyful, uninhibited play without the shadow of adult chaos looming over it. There were books read aloud, songs sung together, quiet moments of connection that accumulated into a foundation of security and love so solid that Sarah could build her entire sense of self upon it. Now, on this August afternoon, Sarah was about to participate in something extraordinary. Judge Harrison had arranged a special ceremony at the courthouse to formally launch the Therapeutic Canine Companion Program for Family Courts, a statewide initiative inspired directly by Sarah's case. Detective and Max were arriving, along with trainers who had been certified to work with therapy dogs in courtroom settings. The program would eventually expand to courts across Ohio and beyond, with the goal of revolutionizing how family courts supported traumatized children. Held Sarah's small hand as they walked through the courthouse corridors. Sarah skipped beside her grandmother, excited about the day but not anxious. She understood that good things were happening, that her story had helped other children, and that Max was coming to see her. When they reached the courtroom, Sarah's face lit up with pure joy. Max was already there, sitting calmly beside Detective, looking even more magnificent than Sarah remembered. "Max," Sarah called out, running toward the dog with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of a child who knew she was safe. Max's entire body seemed to relax when he saw her, his tail beginning that gentle, joyful motion that had become so familiar to Sarah. She threw her arms around his neck, and Max lowered his head to nuzzle her affectionately. The moment was captured by photographers who were documenting the day for the media. These images would appear in newspapers and online publications across the country. A 4-year-old girl embracing a therapy dog, both of them radiating unmistakable connection and joy. Judge Harrison stood on her elevated bench, watching this reunion with obvious satisfaction. She made opening remarks about the significance of the program, about the innovative approaches to child-centered justice, and about Sarah's courage. "This program exists because one child found her voice," Judge Harrison said, looking directly at Sarah. "Because one child was brave enough to tell the truth. Because one beautiful little girl whispered 2 words that changed everything." Then came the ceremonial ribbon cutting, and Sarah stood on either side of a large red ribbon stretched across the courtroom doorway. Judge Harrison handed Sarah a pair of oversized ceremonial scissors. "Sarah, would you like to cut this ribbon?" she asked gently. Sarah looked up at her grandmother, who nodded encouragingly. With gentle guidance, Sarah cut through the ribbon. The gathered crowd erupted in applause. Social workers, judges, child advocacy professionals, and members of the media, all recognizing the profound significance of this moment. In the months that followed, Sarah's case became the subject of countless academic articles, legal seminars, and policy discussions. Law schools across America began teaching Mitchell v. Mitchell as a landmark case in child-centered justice practices. The therapeutic animal-assisted courtroom assessment protocol was formally adopted by Ohio's family court system and began to be implemented in other states. Children's advocacy organizations used Sarah's story to secure funding for similar programs. Universities established grants to train therapy dogs specifically for courtroom work. But what mattered most to Sarah was something far simpler. It was the knowledge that she was safe. It was the routine of morning pancakes with before preschool. It was the bedtime stories and the shaped like the moon. It was the photograph on her bedroom wall showing her hugging Max, her face radiating pure happiness. It was the certainty that she was loved, that her voice mattered, that her truths were honored. On her 5th birthday, Sarah asked to invite Max to her birthday party. Detective came with Max, and the celebration took on an almost ceremonial quality. Sarah had made a card for Max with drawings of dogs and hearts and the words, "Thank you, Max," written in careful letters that had helped her form. As Max ate birthday cake carefully from a special dog-safe plate, Sarah sat beside him, stroking his fur the way she had in that courtroom so many months ago. The motion was now one of joy instead of terror, connection instead of desperate seeking for safety. That evening after the party, tucked Sarah into bed and listened as her granddaughter said her prayers. "Thank you for Grandma," Sarah said. "Thank you for Max. Thank you for making me safe." Held her granddaughter close, marveling at the resilience of children, at the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. The 2 words Sarah had whispered, "Grandma safe," had frozen a courtroom in that extraordinary moment. But they had done so much more than that. They had opened doors to new ways of serving vulnerable children. They had inspired systemic change. They had demonstrated that innovation, compassion, and willingness to think beyond traditional boundaries could transform justice itself. Most importantly, they had given one small girl her life back, a life of safety, love, laughter, and limitless possibility. That was the true measure of Sarah's legacy, far more valuable than any policy change or legal precedent. A child had been saved, and in saving her, she had shown the world how to save so many others.